I'm George Galloway. Thank you for joining me on live stream to talk about Venezuela, the tragedy and the farce. Let's start with the tragedy. As President Nicolas Maduro said today in his appeal to the American people, the United States government, a collection increasingly of lawless gangsters and convicted criminals, are threatening Venezuela with a new Vietnam. But perhaps this generation of Americans needs to remember what happened in the original Vietnam. 58,000 American soldiers came home in boxes. Hundreds of thousands of them came home maimed and wounded, both physically and psychologically, many never recovering from the trauma that they participated in there. The United States was defeated in the Vietnam War and would be defeated again in a Venezuelan war. The reality is this, that Venezuela will resist, and so will millions of its Latin American friends, any American intervention in Venezuela, whether that comes in the form of mercenaries coming across the border from Colombia or from Brazil, or whether it comes from a fully fledged American invasion landing on the beaches of Venezuela. The people will resist. There are 7 million, 8 million, 9 million Chavez supporters in Venezuela. Millions of them are armed. Does anybody imagine that they're just going to disappear at the first whiff of American grape shot? Or do you think that in resisting, Venezuela will quickly become an inferno in which blood and misery will proliferate? That's what Donald Trump and John Bolton and Elliot Abrahams, the convicted criminal now in charge of the Venezuela file, a convicted criminal, a man who was deeply involved with the cutting of throats of church people, of teachers, of medical workers all over Central America, and who was convicted as a criminal. He wouldn't even be allowed into the United States if he were not already a US citizen. The gangsters that are gathered on the Potomac are threatening to open the gates of hell, not just in Venezuela, but throughout Latin America and even inside America itself. So think carefully, mothers of America. Are you ready for your son to die for John Bolton, for Elliot Abrahams, for Donald J. Trump? Think carefully. The tragedy is unfolding and has been for some years. The economic warfare, naked economic warfare in the form of sanctions, embargo, and quarantine has already caused massive and widespread misery for the ordinary people of Venezuela. And when these criminals cry their crocodile tears about suffering, poverty, hunger in Venezuela, just remind yourself it was them, the crocodiles, who caused it. It's them who have brought the Venezuelan economy to its knees through economic warfare, through sanctions, and through the deliberate suppression of the oil price. Venezuela is an oil-dependent economy. And the reason why the United States has strong-armed Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers to up and up and up production levels is to depress the price, so that the depressed price will cause economic difficulties for Venezuela, for Russia, for Iran, as well as boosting the shale oil industry in the United States itself. Now, the reality is this. The oil price went up today. It's a no-lose situation for Trump and the oil industry that backs him, if they can get their hands on Venezuela's oil, then as John Bolton has already admitted on television, this will be a massive boost to US oil interests. Venezuela is, of course, the place where the world's largest treasure trove of black gold oil lies beneath. The world's biggest supply of oil lies in Venezuela. Do you really believe, does anybody really believe that Donald Trump, Bolton, and Abrahams cares about the human rights of the people in Venezuela? They're rolling around in bed with Saudi Arabia, which cuts people's heads off in public, which crucifies them literally in public, which denies everyone in the country the right to vote for anybody. The world's unfreest country, Saudi Arabia, is the best friend of Trump, Bolton, Abrahams, and the rest of that grisly crew. But it's not just tragedy, it's farce. How else can you describe a situation when a man in the street in Caracas declares himself to be the president of a great Latin American country of 30 million people, which the man behind me, and Bolivar, this is Miranda, kicked European colonialism out of their land centuries ago? A guy stands up in the street and says, I'm now the president of Venezuela, and the United States government recognizes him. A man in the street that has never even stood to be the president of Venezuela is now recognized as the president of Venezuela by Trump and now by European governments, including my own, the British government. And the crowning glory, the farce that is the European Parliament, voted overwhelmingly today to recognize that man in the street in Caracas, whose name they don't even know, whose name they cannot even pronounce, is now the president of Venezuela. He's just announced that he's thinking of opening an embassy. Where? Well, in Jerusalem, of course. In occupied Jerusalem, in Israel, one of the first countries to afford him recognition. And just by coincidence, hundreds of Israeli soldiers arrived today in neighboring Brazil with its long border and its jungle between it and Venezuela. Brazil, led by a fascist, Bolsonaro, was one of the first to give recognition to this imposter, the guy in the street in Caracas. The first thing he does is bring in the Israelis. You may not know this, but Brazil has applied to join NATO. Here's another level of farce. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO, North Atlantic. Brazil has just applied to join it, and its membership will be accelerated. That I promise you, because that's what happened to Colombia, another state with a border with Venezuela and many, many grudges against Venezuela. Two NATO countries on either side. Coincidence? I'll let you decide that. But here is my take. These two countries are associates of NATO, and NATO intends to join the regime change operation in Venezuela, whatever the cost in bloodshed, terror, fear, and destruction, on top of the world's largest reservoir of oil. You don't have to be Einstein to work that out. Now, this farce has led to a situation where all over the world people are having to make their stand. The African Union, on the same day as these jokers in the European Parliament, recognized the guy in the street in Caracas. The African Union, which knows something about colonialism, which knows something about invasion, about the looting of its national wealth and treasure, the African Union unanimously continued its recognition of President Nicolas Maduro and Venezuelan sovereignty. I think that's telling, don't you? The European Parliament, the parliament of the countries of modern day colonialism, in the last 200 years, all of them are up to their necks in colonies in the third world. Miranda died in a Spanish prison, having been taken captive by them for his role in the anti-colonial movement in Latin America. So the parliament of the colonialists recognizes the man in the street in Caracas. The parliament, the African Union of the continent most defiled, economically raped, even of its own people, taken off as slaves, unanimously rejects this regime change operation. Now, I've been to Venezuela many times. I want to tell you why all these people hate the Venezuelan revolution so much. They hated Chavez, the previous president of Venezuela, for the same reason that they hate Nicolas Maduro, because both of these presidents have determined to use Venezuela's oil wealth for the benefit of the poorest people in the country, to the disadvantage of the gold-toothed emigres in Miami and the rich 200 families who before Chavez owned and controlled everything in Venezuela. The Chavez revolution built houses, built hospitals, built schools, built universities, gave computers to the students in every school in Venezuela. They completely transformed the lives of the poorest people in Venezuela. And I'm here to tell you, the poorer the Venezuelan, the blacker the Venezuelan, the more mixed race the Venezuelan, the more Native American the Venezuelan, the more they love Chavez, the more they love Maduro. And the converse is also true. The richer the Venezuelan, the more they hate the Chavez revolution. So everybody has to pick a side here. Everybody has to decide. Are you with the rich Venezuelans, or are you with the poor? Are you with the black Venezuelans, or are you with those with gold teeth living in expensive exile? Where do you stand? I know where I stand, and it's not the most difficult question I've ever asked myself. They want to destroy the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela because they cannot bear riches, wealth being under the control of a government, an elected government, repeatedly elected government. Chavez and Maduro have won more elections than any other politicians on the entire planet. Elections that were judged by Jimmy Carter, no less, who won a Nobel Prize for observing other people's elections, as pristine as the best in the world. They can't stand it, the imperialists, the colonialists. How dare these poor southerners from Latin America repeatedly elect a government that acts for the poor and acts against the interests of the rich and powerful. I don't want you to think that I have no criticisms of Nicolas Maduro and of the Venezuelan government. I do. But some of you won't like what those criticisms are. I criticize both Chavez and Maduro for leaving the economy overwhelmingly in the private sector. If you own the economy, you can own the politics, or you can successfully use your ownership of the economy to make life impossible for the elected government. And that's what's happening here. They describe Venezuela as a socialist country. It's not a socialist country. France is more of a socialist country than Venezuela. There's more industry, economy in the hands of the state in France than there is in Venezuela. Venezuela has a socialist government, yes, but it doesn't have a socialist economy. And it should have made much more progress in taking into public hands the commanding heights of the economy and taking away the threat of the richest Venezuelans, holding them to ransom, sabotage, subversion, economic wrecking. My second complaint is equally controversial. There is a real problem of criminality and lawlessness in Venezuela in a way that there simply isn't in Cuba, one of the safest places in the world. If you're a revolution, you have to apply revolutionary tactics against criminals, organized criminals, or merely street thugs, robbers, and murderers. Venezuela is not repressive. It isn't repressive enough to the criminal classes that it should have dealt with long ago. And thirdly, I have real criticisms of corruption in certain elements in Venezuela. It is not possible to be a socialist government and to allow corruption to flourish underneath you. This demands revolutionary rigor to root out corruption and to deal in the most serious possible way with the corrupt elements that are poisoning the well in your society. Now, I've been saying this for some time, and it hurts me to have to say it again. But I tell you this, if you're asking me to choose between Donald Trump, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrahams, or whoever it is, nobody knows their names, who run the European Parliament, or whoever it is that's running the European Union, or Theresa May, or Jeremy Hunt, if you ask me to choose between them and Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, well, that's another question that isn't difficult to answer. I stand with the Venezuelan revolution. I stand with its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who will be the president of Venezuela until the people of Venezuela vote him out. Whatever pretenders, usurpers, jokers, imposters appear on the scene. Finally, I want to say this. When I was in Venezuela last time for Chavez's final victory, not long before he was tragically taken from us, I came back here to discover that there were people, perhaps large numbers of people, perhaps some of them even truly believed it, that thought Chavez had somehow suppressed dissent, opposition, media in Venezuela. In fact, in my time in Venezuela, opposition marches and demonstrations formed up under my hotel window every day, and thousands of oppositionists, some of them armed, many of them ready to set fire to anything they could, marched off in protest against Hugo Chavez. When I looked at the newsstands, it astonished me that the vast majority of the newspapers and the magazines owned by the rich were spewing out their anti-Chavez propaganda. And every time I turned on the TV, no matter how much I channel hopped, all I could find were television stations supporting the opposition. And I suppose the point I'm making is this. The people that told you Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that we must invade and destroy Iraq, the people that told you that we must invade and destroy Libya for freedom and democracy, the people who told you we must invade and destroy Syria in the interests of human rights and democracy, ditto in Afghanistan, ditto in the war camp in the Ukraine and many other places in the world. The same people who told you all these lies are telling you to hate Nicolas Maduro, a man most of you had really given little thought to just a week ago. But a huge effort is now being made to make you think that this man is the worst thing since, I don't know, Bashar al-Assad, Colonel Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Ho Chi Minh, Stalin, Brezhnev. The same people, the same fake news industry which tried to persuade you and successfully persuaded enough of you to allow them to bring about disaster all across the world, now want to march you into yet another disaster. In many cases, the very same politicians, the very same journalists, the very same broadcasters. So, in conclusion, ask yourself this. If they were wrong then, why are they right now? If they were lying then, why are they telling the truth now? Ask yourself that question. I asked myself it. My answer is clear. Viva Venezuela! Viva Chavez! Viva Maduro!
Dale alegría, escucha bien lo que te estoy diciendo. Si viviremos y venceremos. Chávez, corazón del pueblo. Los que quieran patria.